All right, now we're moving into classifying information and supporting the assets within our organization. Classification is concerned with access and categorization, which is concerned with the impact, right? We want to make sure that we categorize our information appropriately because we provide controls for that information based on that classification. Data often is going to be restricted as to who can access that information. So providing confidentiality, ensuring that we're identifying the sensitivity of the information allows us to put in controls for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. A good example is the FIPS 199 special publication and SP 600-60, which is defined as the guide for mapping types of information and information systems to different categories. Now, we don't necessarily need to get into the details of 600-60, but we will see some examples of data classification as part of our discussion here in this particular section. We understand the need in general for data classification, right? We need to be able to classify the data because ultimately we are going to apply controls to that data, not only who can access the information, when they can access it, what its intended use is, but we need to determine the importance and the value of the data. Oftentimes, as we're applying controls to anything, whether it's data or whether it's some sort of policy or procedure that we have in place for information assurance, the amount of money that we spend on those controls, the complexity of those controls are often going to be driven by the importance of what we're trying to protect. Who has access to the data? How is that data secured? How long is that data going to be retained for? How is that data disposed of? Does the data need to be encrypted? What type of encryption is required? What is the baseline encryption standard that we're going to use? Or what is the recommended encryption standard we're going to use? And how is the use of the data appropriate? So with regard to data classification, we think of it, I mean, you guys deal with, obviously, data classification in many different aspects in every day of your life, right? From a data management standpoint, from a business process standpoint, data classification is part of kind of our overall information lifecycle management process. What data types are available? That would be important to understand. Where are certain data types located? Where are they stored? What are the different access levels that need to be implemented? What protection level is implemented, and what does it, and how do those protection levels allow us to adhere to compliance regulations? When data classification with regard to data management is implemented, it provides essentially that bridge between IT professionals as data custodians, processes, application owners or data owners, and so on. We understand the value of the data. We understand much better what part of the data needs to be, or at least what tools and techniques and equipment and whatnot need to be invested in to keep operations running effectively and smoothly. Obviously, data classification and data management is part of an overall risk management strategy. We may have requirements for legal discovery, compliance requirements for government regulations, and so on. So data classification is oftentimes a manual process, but there are many different tools from different vendors that can help us gather information about the data itself. Data classification needs to take into account several different things. What are the regulatory requirements that are necessary for us to classify that data? Is it strategic? Does that have strategic value? Or what is its proprietary worth, the proprietary worth of the data? What are the organization's specific needs? What are the ethical guidelines? That's an important consideration, right? What are the ethical guidelines and the privacy considerations for the data? Or do we have any contractual obligations that require us under contract to manage that data? You know, so data classification can come in, can be, established for many, many different reasons. There are also different types of data classification. From a data management perspective, it could be based on geography, it could be based on chronology. We can use qualitative or quantitative approaches, and there should always be kind of 3 dimensions that we consider when we're considering classifying data from a data management perspective. How easy can the data be used to identify a particular individual? In other words, what are privacy considerations? How much damage, that would be the identifiability of the data, by the way. How much damage could be done if the data reached the wrong hands, right? That's the sensitivity aspect that we talked about previously. How readily available is the data itself? That's the scarcity aspect. All right. We can also do what we call semi-structured or polystructured data classification. Time criteria is kind of one of the most common aspects that we use based on time of access, time of update, etc. We can also have metadata criteria. What is the data type? What is the name of the data? Who's the owner of the data? Where is the location of the data, geolocation information, and so on. Or we can classify based on content criteria. So we have different content classification algorithms that we use. We also have to consider disaster recovery issues, business continuity issues, data center resource issues for actually storing and accessing the information, specific hardware and performance limitations, and so on. All right. Now, if it's in regard to business intelligence, data classification comes into play as well. We see here that we have different ways of potentially classifying information. Is it private information? Things like personally identifiable information like social security numbers, banking information, credit card information. Is the information company restricted? Restricted to the CXOs or executive office or a subset of employees? Is it company confidential, meaning that it's visible to the whole company but not necessarily public, or is it public information? Okay. Individual who owns the data should be the one who's classifying that data. Ultimately, it's the owner's responsibility to determine its use, longevity, etc., all the aspects that we talked about, including the classification. We need to also make sure that we review data classification, looking for discrepancies. Data does the nature of the data, the usefulness of the data, the relevance of the data does tend to change over time. So its classifications may change over time. If there are deviations in classification, why did that deviation occur? What were the specific circumstances? Who authorized the change in that classification? Is there appropriate documentation to support that particular change? We also consider what our data retention schedules are. with the idea that we're trying to reduce cost. We want to be able to index the data quickly, be able to search the data quickly, especially if we're accessing that information for specific purposes, like in this case, litigation.